The explosion rocked the auto shop at 3:45 p.m., sending debris flying and customers running for cover. While everyone panicked, Tony Rodriguez did something that shocked witnesses. He moved toward the blast with the calm precision of someone who'd seen much worse. Because what looked like an accident was actually a bomb, and the mechanic they'd all ignored was the only person qualified to handle it. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this incredible tale of hidden expertise and life-saving skills, tell me in the comments from which city are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who serve in silence. Rodriguez Auto Repair sat on the corner of Maple Street and 3rd Avenue in suburban Phoenix, the kind of neighborhood shop where locals brought their cars for honest work at fair prices. The building was small, cramped, and filled with the organized chaos that comes from 30 years of fixing everything from pickup trucks to luxury sedans. Tony Rodriguez had owned the shop for 12 years, building a reputation as the guy who could fix anything, no matter how complicated or hopeless it seemed. Customers appreciated his thorough work, his reasonable prices, and his ability to explain complex mechanical problems in terms that regular people could understand. At 54 years old, Tony looked like exactly what he was, a working mechanic with grease under his fingernails and motor oil stains on his coveralls. He was polite but not chatty, skilled but not boastful, the kind of small business owner who became part of the community fabric without drawing much attention to himself. What customers didn't know was that Tony Rodriguez had once been Staff Sergeant Antonio Rodriguez, 89th Military Police Brigade, explosive ordnance disposal specialist with over 200 confirmed IED disarmaments in Iraq and Afghanistan. The bomb had been placed in a dumpster behind Martinez Family Restaurant, next door to Tony's shop. It was crude but effective, a mixture of household chemicals and metal fragments designed to kill or maim anyone within a 50-foot radius. The kind of device that terrorists used when they wanted maximum casualties with minimal sophistication. Tony was working under the hood of a 2018 Honda Civic when the explosion occurred. The blast wave knocked him backward, shattered windows throughout the shop, and sent tools flying across the concrete floor. But while his 3 customers dove for cover and his assistant ran for the exit, Tony's training kicked in automatically. He recognized the sound immediately, not an accidental gas explosion or electrical fire, but a deliberate detonation with characteristics that suggested military-grade explosives mixed with improvised components. Someone had built a bomb and placed it close enough to his shop to cause maximum damage. Tony's first instinct was to evaluate the area and call the police, following standard civilian protocols for suspected terrorist attacks. But as he helped customers to safety and assess the damage, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Smoke was rising from 2 other locations in the immediate area. The restaurant explosion hadn't been an isolated incident. Someone had planted multiple devices throughout the neighborhood, probably timed to detonate in sequence to maximize casualties and hinder emergency response. Tony counted at least 3 separate smoke plumes within a 4-block radius. "Everyone out!" Tony shouted, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded EOD teams in hostile territory. "This is not an accident. Move away from the building and stay together." As customers and nearby business owners gathered in the parking lot across the street, Tony made a decision that violated every safety protocol he'd learned in civilian life but aligned perfectly with everything he'd been trained to do in the military. Instead of waiting for the bomb squad to arrive, Tony returned to his shop and opened a tool chest that contained equipment no auto mechanic should have possessed. Hidden beneath normal automotive tools was a collection of specialized devices that had once been used to save lives in the most dangerous places on Earth. Wire cutters designed for diffusing explosives. Digital multimeters calibrated to detect electrical circuits in improvised devices. Protective equipment that could shield someone from blast fragments. And a portable X-ray system that could reveal the internal components of suspicious packages without triggering detonation mechanisms. Tony had kept the equipment for 12 years, telling himself it was just sentimental attachment to tools that had defined his military career. But deep down, he'd always known that someday his 2 worlds might collide, and when that happened, he'd need to choose between being Tony Rodriguez, mechanic, and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, EOD specialist. The choice was made for him when he spotted the 4th device. It was hidden under a car in the parking lot of the elementary school across the street, positioned where the afternoon dismissal crowd would gather in less than 20 minutes. Parents picking up their children, kids running toward family cars, teachers directing traffic, all of them would be in the blast radius when the timer reached 0. Tony grabbed his hidden equipment and ran toward the school, knowing that he was about to reveal abilities he'd spent 12 years keeping secret. But some things were more important than maintaining anonymity, and protecting children was at the top of that list. Tony approached the suspicious device with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 2 combat deployments. The package was wedged under a minivan in the school pickup lane, positioned to maximize casualties when parents arrived to collect their children. Using his portable X-ray equipment, Tony scanned the device without touching it. The internal image revealed a timer mechanism connected to approximately 3 pounds of military-grade plastic explosive, surrounded by metal fragments designed to create maximum shrapnel damage. Professional construction. Military components. Timer set for 4:05 p.m. exactly when the school dismissal rush would put the maximum number of civilians in the blast radius. Tony opened his toolkit and selected instruments he hadn't used in 12 years but whose operation was burned into muscle memory. Wire strippers, circuit testers, and bypass connectors that had once been the difference between successful missions and catastrophic failures. The device was more sophisticated than typical homemade bombs, suggesting someone with military or engineering training had built it. But it also had vulnerabilities that Tony recognized from similar devices he'd encountered in Iraq, where insurgents often used identical construction methods. "Sir, you need to evaluate the area immediately." Tony looked up to see Officer Martinez from the Phoenix Police Department approaching with her weapon drawn. Behind her, he could see other officers establishing a perimeter and directing traffic away from the school. "Officer, this device is set to detonate in 14 minutes, Tony said without looking up from his work. "The bomb squad response time is at least 20 minutes. If we wait for official help, people are going to die." "Who are you? How do you know about explosives?" Tony paused in his work, considering how to answer a question that would inevitably lead to others he'd spent 12 years avoiding. "My name is Tony Rodriguez. I own the auto shop across the street. And I used to disarm bombs like this for a living." Officer Martinez stared at him for a moment, trying to process what she was hearing. "You're EOD?" "Was. 12 years retired. But the training doesn't go away." "Sir, we can't authorize civilians to dash." "Officer," Tony interrupted, his voice carrying the calm authority that had once briefed military commanders on explosive threats, "in 11 minutes, this device is going to kill everyone within 50 feet of this parking lot. That includes the children walking out of that school and the parents coming to pick them up. We can argue about authorization, or you can help me save their lives." Officer Martinez holstered her weapon and keyed her radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I need you to contact Army EOD at Luke Air Force Base and verify the credentials of Antonio Rodriguez, former military explosive specialist. Also, I need all available units to establish a wider perimeter around Lincoln Elementary." While Officer Martinez coordinated the emergency response, Tony continued working with the focused intensity that had made him one of the most effective EOD technicians in his unit. The timer showed 9 minutes remaining, but Tony had disarmed similar devices in less time under much worse conditions. The key was identifying the trigger mechanism and finding a way to interrupt the electrical circuit without activating fail-safe detonators. Tony traced the wiring with instruments that detected electrical current, mapping the device's internal architecture with the same care he'd once used to defuse roadside bombs in Fallujah. "Got it," Tony murmured, locating the primary circuit that connected the timer to the detonator. "Simple bypass, but it's got a trembler switch as backup. If I cut the wrong wire or move too fast, it goes off anyway." Officer Martinez watched Tony work with professional equipment that had no business being in the possession of a civilian mechanic. "Sir, how long since you've done this?" 12 years since I've disarmed a live device. But I've been studying new techniques, keeping current with EOD methodology." "Old habits." Tony selected a wire cutter that had been modified for precision work, positioning it carefully around the bypass circuit while monitoring the trembler switch for any signs of activation. One smooth cut, applied at exactly the right moment, would disable the device safely. 5 minutes, Officer Martinez announced. I know. Tony's voice was steady, betraying none of the adrenaline that was flooding his system. He'd learned long ago that panic was the enemy of precision, and precision was the only thing that kept people alive in situations like this. The cut was perfect. Clean, precise, and applied at exactly the right moment to interrupt the electrical circuit without triggering the fail-safe mechanism. The timer display went dark, and the immediate threat was neutralized. Device is safe, Tony announced, setting down his tools and stepping back from the minivan. But there are at least 3 more devices in the area, probably set for sequential detonation. We need to find them before dash. The second explosion interrupted Tony's briefing, this one coming from the direction of the shopping center 2 blocks north. Black smoke billowed into the afternoon sky, and the sound of sirens began filling the air as emergency responders rushed toward multiple blast sites. Officer Martinez, Tony said, gathering his equipment with the efficient movements of someone who'd done this many times before, I'm going to need your help identifying the other device locations. And you're going to need to trust that I know what I'm doing, even if my credentials are a little out of date. To understand how an EOD specialist ended up running an auto repair shop, you need to understand what Tony Rodriguez had been before the war changed everything for him. Tony was born in El Paso, Texas, in 1969, the son of a construction worker who'd served in Vietnam and a high school teacher who'd immigrated from Mexico as a child. He grew up in a household where hard work was expected, education was valued, and service to others was considered the highest calling a person could answer. In high school, Tony excelled in mathematics and science, with a particular aptitude for understanding how things worked and how to fix them when they broke. His teachers encouraged him to pursue engineering, but Tony was drawn to more immediate applications of his technical skills. When he enlisted in the Army in 1987, Tony requested assignment to military occupational specialties that would challenge his problem-solving abilities while serving his country's interests. He scored high enough on aptitude tests to qualify for several elite programs, but it was explosive ordnance disposal training that captured his imagination. EOD school was legendary for breaking candidates who thought they were ready for anything. The physical demands were extreme, but the psychological pressure was designed to identify those who could function under life and death stress while making decisions that affected not just their own survival but the safety of entire units. Tony not only survived but excelled. His methodical approach to problem solving, combined with steady hands and an analytical mind, made him exactly the kind of technician the Army needed for its most dangerous assignments. His first deployment was to Saudi Arabia in 1991, during Operation Desert Storm. Tony's unit was responsible for clearing explosive devices from areas where coalition forces would be operating, as well as disarming unexploded ordnance left behind by retreating Iraqi forces. The work was technically challenging and extremely dangerous, but Tony found purpose in missions that directly protected American soldiers and innocent civilians. Every device he successfully disarmed was a life saved, a family that wouldn't receive a folded flag, a community that could rebuild without fear. Over the next 15 years, Staff Sergeant Tony Rodriguez deployed to every region where American forces encountered explosive threats. Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, wherever IEDs and unexploded ordnance posed dangers to military personnel and civilian populations. His specialty was improvised explosive devices, the roadside bombs and suicide vests that had become the signature weapons of asymmetric warfare. Tony developed techniques for identifying and disarming IEDs that were adopted throughout the EOD community, and his unit maintained one of the highest success rates in the Army. The statistics were impressive: over 200 confirmed disarmaments, 0 casualties among the soldiers he protected, and numerous innovations in EOD methodology that saved lives across multiple theaters of operation. But the psychological toll was immense. For 15 years, Tony lived with the knowledge that one mistake, one moment of inattention, one miscalculation could result not just in his own death but in the deaths of everyone around him. Every device was a puzzle where the wrong solution meant catastrophic failure. The breaking point came during his fourth deployment to Iraq in 2006. Tony's unit was called to disarm a suspected car bomb in a marketplace in Ramadi, where hundreds of civilians were going about their daily business unaware of the threat in their midst. The device was more sophisticated than anything Tony had encountered before, with multiple redundant firing circuits, anti-tamper mechanisms, and a timer that had been designed to defeat conventional disarmament techniques. Tony worked for over an hour, carefully tracing circuits and identifying bypass routes while sweat dripped onto sensitive components. He successfully disarmed the primary device, but missed a secondary charge that had been hidden in the car's spare tire. The explosion wasn't large enough to cause the casualties that the full device would have created, but it was big enough to injure 12 civilians and kill a 7-year-old girl who'd been playing nearby. Tony wasn't injured in the blast, but something inside him was permanently damaged. The child's death wasn't his fault. He'd prevented a much larger tragedy, but the knowledge that his skills had been insufficient to save everyone haunted him in ways that his military training hadn't prepared him for. He completed his deployment, received commendations for his service, and was offered opportunities for promotion and assignment to even more challenging positions. Instead, Tony submitted paperwork for retirement and began the difficult process of transitioning to civilian life. The auto repair shop was supposed to be a complete break from his military career. Working with car engines instead of explosive devices, solving mechanical problems instead of life-and-death puzzles, using his technical skills in an environment where mistakes resulted in inconvenience rather than casualties. For 12 years, it had worked. Tony built a successful business, earned the trust of his community, and found satisfaction in work that helped people without putting anyone at risk. He kept his EOD equipment out of sentiment, but never expected to use it again. Until the afternoon when bombs started exploding in his neighborhood, and Tony Rodriguez discovered that some missions never really end, they just wait for the right moment to call you back to service. The second explosion had come from Miller's hardware store, 2 blocks from the elementary school. As Tony and Officer Martinez raced toward the scene, a third detonation echoed from the direction of the community center, filling the afternoon air with smoke and the sound of emergency sirens. "This is coordinated," Tony told Officer Martinez as they approached the hardware store. "Sequential detonations designed to maximize casualties and scatter emergency response. Whoever planned this has military training." The hardware store blast had collapsed part of the building's front wall and shattered windows in a 3-block radius. But Tony's trained eye immediately identified something more dangerous than structural damage, a pattern of debris that suggested the explosion had been designed to drive people toward a specific area. "Officer Martinez, we need to evaluate everyone from the parking lot behind the store," Tony said, his voice carrying the urgency that came from recognizing a tactical setup. "This explosion was meant to herd people into a kill zone." "How can you tell?" Tony pointed to the blast pattern, explaining what most people would see as random destruction but what his training revealed as deliberate design. The shaped charge was positioned to collapse the front of the building but leave the rear exit accessible. When people evaluated, they'd naturally move to the back parking lot. That's where the next device will be. They found the 4th bomb exactly where Tony had predicted, hidden under a delivery truck in the rear parking area where employees and customers had gathered after evaluating the building. The timer showed 8 minutes remaining, and unlike the school device, this one was surrounded by people who couldn't be evaluated quickly enough. "I need everyone to move slowly away from the vehicles," Tony announced, his voice carrying the calm authority that had once coordinated EOD operations in combat zones. "Don't run, don't panic, just walk toward the street and keep walking until you're at least 2 blocks away." While Officer Martinez coordinated the evacuation, Tony examined the device with his portable X-ray equipment. What he saw made his blood run cold, not just a bomb, but a sophisticated anti-personnel weapon designed to kill everyone within a 100-foot radius. "This is military grade," Tony told Officer Martinez as civilians continued moving away from the blast zone. C4 plastic explosive, ball-bearing shrapnel, and multiple redundant firing circuits. Whoever built this has access to restricted materials and advanced training. "Can you disarm it?" Tony studied the device's internal structure, tracing electrical pathways and identifying potential bypass routes. The construction was professional, but it followed patterns he recognized from his years of EOD work in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yes, but I need you to clear everyone from a wider radius. If I make a mistake, this thing will level everything within a block. How much time do we have? 6 minutes. Maybe less if there are anti-tamper devices I can't detect from this angle. Tony began working with the focused intensity that had kept him alive through 200 similar encounters. But this device was different and more complex, with security measures that suggested the bomber had studied American EOD techniques and designed countermeasures specifically to defeat them. Tony. Officer Martinez had returned from coordinating the evacuation. Bomb squad is still 10 minutes out. Fire department reports 2 more suspicious packages at the mall and the high school. And there's something else. What? The FBI thinks this is connected to a terrorist cell that's been planning attacks on suburban targets. If they're right, these devices are just the opening phase of a larger operation. Tony paused in his work, considering the implications. A coordinated attack on multiple civilian targets, using sophisticated devices that required military training to construct. This wasn't random violence, it was a strategic operation designed to terrorize an entire community. Officer Martinez, I need you to contact the FBI and tell them that the bomber has military explosive training, probably Army EOD or similar background. These devices are using techniques and components that aren't available to typical domestic terrorists. How can you be sure? Tony pointed to specific components visible on his X-ray display. Because I recognize the construction methods. Whoever built this learned from the same manuals I studied, probably trained at the same facilities I graduated from. This is an inside job. The realization hit both of them simultaneously. Someone with authorized access to military explosive materials and classified EOD techniques was using that knowledge to attack American civilians. The bomber wasn't just a terrorist, he was a traitor. 3 minutes, Officer Martinez announced. Tony made the final connections that would bypass the device's firing circuits, his hands moving with the muscle memory that had been dormant for 12 years but never forgotten. The timer stopped at 47 seconds, and another threat was neutralized. But as they moved toward the next suspected device location, Tony realized that his 12-year retirement from EOD work had just ended permanently. Whoever was conducting this attack knew too much about American explosive techniques, and Tony might be the only person available who could match that knowledge. The command post had been established in the parking lot of Roosevelt Middle School, far enough from the blast sites to be safe but close enough to coordinate the response. Tony found himself briefing federal agents, local law enforcement, and military explosive specialists who'd been rushed in from Luke Air Force Base. Based on the construction techniques and materials used, Tony explained to the assembled group, we're looking for someone with advanced military explosive training, access to restricted materials, and detailed knowledge of American EOD countermeasures. FBI Special Agent Sarachin nodded grimly. That narrows the suspect pool considerably. How many people have that kind of training? Current and former military EOD specialists, some civilian contractors who've worked with explosive devices, maybe a few people from other agencies with similar training. We're talking about maybe a few hundred people nationwide. And locally? Tony thought about the Phoenix area's military presence, defense contractors, and veteran population. Maybe 20 people within 100 miles who'd have the skills to build devices this sophisticated. Agent Chen pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through classified databases. We've been tracking communication intercepts that suggested a domestic terrorist operation was being planned in this area. The timing matches what we're seeing today. Any names? Several. But one stands out, Marcus Webb, former Army EOD specialist who was discharged in 2018 for psychological issues. He's been making threats against civilian targets, specifically schools and community centers. Tony felt ice form in his stomach. He knew that name from his military service. Webb had been a competent EOD technician who'd served in Afghanistan during Tony's final deployment. But something had gone wrong during his last tour, and he'd been sent home early for reasons that weren't made public. I know Webb, Tony said quietly. Served with him in Afghanistan. Good technician, but he had problems with civilian casualties. There was an incident involving a family who got caught in an IED blast he was trying to disarm. What kind of problems? Tony remembered the after-action reports and the whispered conversations in the barracks after Webb's breakdown. He blamed American foreign policy for putting him in situations where he couldn't save everyone. Started talking about how the real terrorists were the people who sent us overseas to clean up messes they'd created. Agent Chen's expression darkened. That matches the psychological profile we developed from his online communications. Anti-government rhetoric, blame for civilian casualties, and specific threats against soft targets that represented American civilian society. The radio crackled with reports from bomb disposal teams that were working the remaining device locations. 2 more bombs had been found and disarmed, but the pattern was becoming clear. Webb was targeting places where families gathered, where children would be present, where the maximum psychological impact could be achieved. Agent Chen, Tony said, studying the map that showed confirmed device locations, I think I know where the next bomb is. Where? Tony pointed to a location that hadn't yet been searched but fit perfectly with the pattern Webb was following. The youth soccer complex on Miller Road. Saturday games, hundreds of kids and parents, perfect target for someone who wants to terrorize suburban families. That's 3 miles from here. Bomb squad is tied up with the devices we've already found. Tony looked at his equipment kit, at the tools he'd used to save lives for 15 years before spending 12 years trying to forget he'd ever needed them. Agent Chen, I can get there in 10 minutes. But I'll need authorization to act independently if I find a device. Mr. Rodriguez, you're a civilian. I can't authorize dash. Agent Chen, Tony interrupted, Marcus Webb knows exactly how your bomb disposal units operate. He's designed these devices specifically to defeat official EOD response. But he doesn't know that I'm here, and he doesn't know that I've figured out his pattern. That gives us an advantage we can't afford to waste. Agent Chen stared at Tony for a moment, weighing protocols against practical realities. If there's a device at the soccer complex, how much time do we have? Tony checked his watch against the timing pattern Webb had established with the previous explosions. Maybe 15 minutes before the next scheduled detonation. Not enough time for official response, but enough time for someone who knows what to look for. Go, Agent Chen said, handing Tony a radio and federal credentials. But stay in constant communication. If you find a device, I want real-time updates on everything you do. Tony gathered his equipment and ran toward his truck, knowing that he was about to face the most challenging EOD operation of his career. Not just because of the technical difficulties, but because he'd be trying to outthink someone who'd been trained by the same military that had trained him. The drive to the soccer complex took 8 minutes through traffic that was being diverted around the blast sites. As Tony pulled into the parking lot, he could see parents arriving to pick up children from afternoon practice, coaches gathering equipment, and players heading toward family cars. It was exactly the kind of scene that Webb would want to destroy: innocent families, children at play, the American suburban lifestyle that he'd apparently decided to blame for the trauma he'd experienced overseas. Tony found the device in less than 3 minutes, hidden under the bleachers where it would maximize casualties among spectators. The timer showed 11 minutes remaining, and the X-ray revealed the most sophisticated bomb Webb had constructed yet. The device under the soccer bleachers was Webb's masterpiece, a sophisticated bomb with multiple redundant firing systems, anti-tamper mechanisms, and enough explosive power to level the entire viewing area. But it was also his trap. As Tony began his examination, he realized that Webb had anticipated someone with EOD training would eventually respond to his attacks. The device was designed not just to kill civilians, but to eliminate any military explosive specialist who tried to disarm it. Agent Chen, this is Rodriguez, Tony said into his radio. The device is more complex than the others. Webb knows someone like me would eventually show up, and he's planned accordingly. What do you mean? The bomb has a secondary trigger designed to activate if someone with EOD training attempts disarmament. He's using techniques specifically designed to kill military explosive specialists. Tony studied the device's internal structure, identifying not just a primary explosive charge but a second bomb that would detonate if the wrong disarmament procedure was attempted. Webb had essentially built a trap within a trap, using his knowledge of American EOD methodology against anyone who tried to stop him. Can you disarm it? Maybe. But I need to think like Webb, not like the Army manual. He's counting on me to follow standard procedure, which means I need to do something unexpected. Tony had worked with Webb for 6 months in Afghanistan and remembered his approach to explosive device construction. Webb was methodical, technically proficient, but he also had a tendency to over-engineer his solutions. That might be his weakness. 9 minutes remaining, Tony announced, beginning to trace circuits that would bypass both the primary and secondary firing mechanisms. But I think I see his mistake. Webb had designed the trap assuming that any EOD specialist would follow current military procedures. But Tony's experience went back further than Webb's, to earlier versions of EOD training that used different approaches to complex devices. Using techniques that predated Webb's military service, Tony began working on the device from an angle that Webb hadn't anticipated. Instead of approaching the primary firing circuit directly, Tony accessed the power supply and began systematically draining the capacitors that stored energy for detonation. Rodriguez, this is Agent Chen. We've located Webb. He's in a van about 2 blocks from your position, apparently monitoring police communications and waiting for the detonation. Can you take him without alerting him that his bomb is being disarmed? Negative. He's got sight lines to the soccer complex and will see any law enforcement approach. If he realizes his device isn't going to detonate on schedule, he might have a backup plan. Tony continued working while considering tactical options. Webb was smart enough to have contingency plans, but he was also psychologically unstable enough to make mistakes under pressure. Agent Chen, at exactly the moment this device was scheduled to detonate, I want you to create a distraction that looks like an explosion from Webb's perspective. Not close enough to put anyone at risk, but visible enough to make him think his bomb worked. What kind of distraction? Flashbang grenades, smoke canisters, anything that creates light and smoke visible from his position. He'll think his device worked and won't realize he's been defeated until you're close enough to take him into custody. Tony finished draining the device's power supply and carefully disconnected the firing circuits. The bomb was now completely safe, but Webb didn't know that yet. Device is neutralized, Tony reported. Timer shows 3 minutes, but there's no power to the detonation system. Webb's trap has been disarmed. Roger. Preparing distraction in 2 minutes. All units stand by for arrest operation. Tony gathered his equipment and moved to a safe position where he could observe Webb's capture. Through binoculars, he could see the van where Webb was waiting for his final bomb to create the casualties that would complete his revenge against the society he blamed for his psychological trauma. The flashbang detonation created exactly the effect Tony had predicted. From Webb's position, it looked like his device had exploded on schedule, taking with it dozens of innocent families who'd been gathering at the soccer complex. Webb's reaction was visible even from 2 blocks away: satisfaction, vindication, and the psychological release of someone who believed he'd finally struck back at the forces that had damaged him. He didn't notice the tactical teams moving into position around his van until it was too late. The arrest was textbook, coordinated, professional, and executed without giving Webb any opportunity to activate backup devices or escape. Within minutes, the man who'd spent months planning a terrorist attack on his own community was in federal custody. Rodriguez, this is Agent Chen. Target is in custody. How many devices total? Tony reviewed the pattern of bomb placements and timing sequences Webb had established. I count 7 devices total. All have been located and disarmed. But we need to search his residence and any storage facilities he might have rented. Someone this methodical probably has additional materials. The search of Webb's apartment revealed the extent of his preparation, detailed maps of potential targets, surveillance photos of community events, and enough explosive materials to conduct multiple additional attacks. Tony's intervention had stopped not just the current operation but potentially months of future violence. Word of Tony's role in stopping the terrorist attack spread through the Phoenix area faster than news media could report it. The quiet mechanic who'd fixed their cars for 12 years had turned out to be the person who'd saved their children, their families, and their community from a coordinated bombing campaign. The first person to visit Rodriguez Auto Repair after the incident was Maria Santos, whose 8-year-old son played soccer at the complex where Tony had disarmed the final bomb. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, approaching the shop where Tony was trying to return to normal routine, "I don't know how to thank you for what you did." Tony looked up from the engine he was working on, the same Honda Civic he'd been repairing when the first bomb exploded. "Mrs. Santos, I just did what needed to be done. Anyone with my training would have done the same thing. But you were the one who was there. You were the one who knew what to do. My son is alive because you chose to act instead of waiting for someone else." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other customers, neighbors, and community members who'd learned about Tony's military background and his role in preventing what could have been the deadliest terrorist attack in Phoenix history. "Tony," said Bill Martinez, whose hardware store had been one of the bomb targets, "why didn't you ever tell anyone about your military service? We had no idea you were a war hero." Tony paused in his work, considering how to answer a question that cut to the heart of why he'd chosen anonymity over recognition. "Mr. Martinez, I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was trying to be useful in a different way. Fixing cars, helping neighbors, being part of the community without anyone having to worry about what I'd done before." The local news media had discovered Tony's story and were requesting interviews, but he declined most of them. He wasn't comfortable with attention that focused on his military service rather than the community he'd been serving for 12 years. But the interview he did accept was with Channel 12's Veteran Affairs correspondent, who understood the complexities of military transition and the challenges that combat veterans faced when returning to civilian life. "Mr. Rodriguez," the interviewer asked, "you spent 15 years as one of the military's most elite explosive specialists, then 12 years fixing cars. Help us understand that transition." Tony thought carefully before answering. "When you spend years dealing with life and death situations, civilian work can feel small. Not unimportant, but different in scope. Fixing someone's car doesn't have the same immediate impact as disarming a bomb that could kill dozens of people. But yesterday, those two worlds came together. Yes, and I realized something important. I'd been thinking about my military service and my civilian work as completely separate things. But they're not. Both jobs are about serving others, solving problems that people can't solve themselves, and making sure families can go about their lives safely." The interview revealed something that surprised many people who'd known Tony as their neighborhood mechanic. He'd been serving his community all along, just in a different uniform and with different tools. FBI agent Chen visited the shop a week after the incident to discuss the investigation's findings and to formally recognize Tony's contribution to public safety. "Mr. Rodriguez, the FBI would like to offer you a consulting position with our domestic terrorism unit. Your expertise with explosive devices and your understanding of how former military personnel might use that training for criminal purposes could be valuable." Tony considered the offer while working on a transmission that belonged to one of his regular customers. "Agent Chen, I appreciate the recognition, but I like what I'm doing here. These people trust me to keep their cars running, and they trusted me to keep their families safe when that was needed. I don't want to lose that. The position would be part-time, consulting only when your specific expertise is needed. You could maintain your business and your role in the community." Tony looked around the shop that had been his sanctuary for 12 years, at the customers who'd become his neighbors, at the community that had accepted him without needing to know about his military background. "Let me think about it," he said finally. "But whatever I decide, this shop stays open, and these people remain my priority." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tommy Santos, Maria's 8-year-old son, who'd insisted his mother bring him to meet the man who'd protected his soccer game. "Mr. Rodriguez," Tommy said with the serious tone that children use when discussing important matters, "my mom says you stopped the bad man from hurting people at my soccer practice." Tony knelt down to Tommy's eye level, thinking about how to explain complex concepts to a child without sharing details that would create nightmares. "Tommy, there was a bad person who wanted to hurt people at your soccer game. I was able to stop him because I learned some special skills in the Army a long time ago. The important thing is that you and all the other kids are safe. Were you scared?" Tony smiled, remembering similar conversations he'd had with his nephew about facing difficult situations. "Yes, Tommy. I was scared. But being scared doesn't mean you can't do what's right. Sometimes being scared means you understand how important it is to protect people you care about." Tommy nodded solemnly, then surprised Tony with a question that revealed more insight than most adults possessed. "Mr. Rodriguez, are you going to keep fixing cars, or are you going to go back to being a soldier?" Tony looked at the boy's mother, at the shop that had been his sanctuary, at the community that had accepted him without needing to understand his past. "I'm going to keep fixing cars, Tommy. But now everyone knows that if they need someone to keep them safe, I can help with that too." The FBI consulting arrangement Tony accepted allowed him to use his EOD expertise on cases involving domestic terrorism while maintaining his automotive business. It was part-time work that called upon his specialized knowledge without forcing him to abandon the civilian life he'd built. "What makes Tony valuable," explained Agent Chin during a federal law enforcement briefing, "is that he understands both the technical aspects of explosive devices and the community context where these threats occur. He's not just an expert, he's a neighbor." Tony's shop became an unofficial meeting place for local veterans who were struggling with civilian transition issues. His success in finding meaningful work that honored his military experience while serving his community became a model that other former service members wanted to understand and replicate. "Mr. Rodriguez," said James Patterson, a recently separated Marine who was having difficulty finding purpose in civilian employment, "everyone keeps telling me to forget about my military experience and focus on civilian skills. But you found a way to use both. How?" Tony was replacing brake pads on James's motorcycle, work that required the same attention to detail and systematic approach that had kept him alive during explosive device disposal operations. "James, the mistake is thinking that military skills and civilian skills are different things. They're not. Problem solving, attention to detail, working under pressure, taking responsibility for other people's safety, those abilities transfer to any job where they're needed. But automotive repair isn't life-and-death work like EOD." Tony paused in his work, considering how to explain something that had taken him years to understand. "When I repair someone's brakes, I'm responsible for their family getting home safely. When I diagnose an engine problem correctly, I'm preventing a breakdown that could leave someone stranded in a dangerous situation. The stakes are different, but the responsibility is the same." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Sarah Martinez, a psychiatrist who worked with combat veterans and had been studying Tony's successful transition from military to civilian life. "Tony, I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I wanted to discuss the veteran transition workshop you're planning. The VA is very interested in your approach." Tony had agreed to develop a program that would help other EOD specialists and combat veterans find civilian careers that utilized their military training without requiring them to work in high-stress, combat-adjacent fields. "The key insight Tony has developed," Dr. Martinez explained to James, "is that veterans don't need to choose between using their military skills and living peaceful civilian lives. They can do both, if they find the right applications." Tony's approach was already showing results with other veterans in the Phoenix area. Former medics were becoming emergency medical technicians, ex-military police were working in civilian security, and combat engineers were finding careers in construction and infrastructure development. "The program isn't about finding jobs that are exactly like military specialties," Tony told the group of veterans who'd gathered in his shop for an informal mentoring session. "It's about identifying the core skills you developed in the military and finding civilian applications that serve your community." But Tony's most important contribution to veteran transition was his example of how military and civilian identities could coexist rather than compete. He hadn't abandoned his EOD expertise when he became a mechanic, he'd simply found a different way to serve others until circumstances required his military skills again. 5 years after the bombing incident that revealed his identity, Tony Rodriguez had become something he'd never expected: a bridge between military and civilian communities who proved that veterans could serve their neighborhoods without losing their military identity. His auto repair shop remained the neighborhood business where people brought their cars for honest work, but it had also evolved into a community resource that provided security expertise, veteran mentorship, and a model for how former military personnel could integrate into civilian society while maintaining their warrior ethos. The FBI consulting work had expanded beyond domestic terrorism cases to include training programs for local law enforcement agencies that needed to understand how military explosive devices might be adapted for criminal use. Tony's unique value, explained Captain Rodriguez of the Phoenix Police Department, is that he can think like both a military EOD specialist and a civilian community member. That dual perspective helps us understand threats from angles that pure military or pure civilian experts might miss. But Tony's most meaningful work continued to be the individual relationships he'd built with veterans who were struggling to find purpose in civilian life. His shop had become an unofficial counseling center where former service members could discuss their transition challenges with someone who'd successfully navigated the same journey. "Mr. Rodriguez," said Maria Santos, a former Army medic who'd been working dead-end retail jobs since her discharge, "I feel like I'm wasting everything I learned in the military. How do I find work that matters?" Tony was diagnosing an electrical problem in Maria's car, using systematic troubleshooting methods that paralleled the analytical approach he'd used for explosive device disposal. "Maria, you're not wasting your medical training by working civilian jobs. You're just applying it differently. The assessment skills, the ability to work under pressure, the commitment to helping people, those abilities make you valuable in any healthcare setting. But nobody wants to hire a veteran for medical positions. They want civilian certifications, civilian experience." Tony paused in his work, remembering his own frustration with employers who couldn't see how military training translated to civilian capabilities. "That's changing, slowly. But in the meantime, you have to find ways to demonstrate your abilities rather than just describing them." Tony had helped Maria enroll in a paramedic training program that credited her military medical experience toward civilian certification. Within 6 months, she'd found employment with the Phoenix Fire Department, where her combat medical training was recognized as an asset rather than an irrelevant military background. "The transformation in Maria was remarkable," observed Dr. Patricia Chen, the veterans counselor who'd been tracking Tony's mentoring success. "She went from feeling disconnected from her military service to understanding how that service could continue in civilian contexts." Tony's influence had spread beyond individual veterans to the broader community's relationship with former military personnel. His example had shown neighbors that veterans weren't just people transitioning away from military service, they were ongoing community assets whose training and experience could benefit civilian society. "Since Tony's story became public," explained Jennifer Walsh, a neighborhood association president, "our community has developed a different appreciation for the veterans who live and work among us. We understand now that military service doesn't end with discharge, it continues in different forms." The auto repair shop had also become a training ground where Tony taught other veterans how to start their own businesses using skills they developed during military service. His success had inspired former soldiers, sailors, and Marines to pursue entrepreneurship rather than just seeking employment with existing companies. "Tony proved something important," said David Kim, a former Marine who'd opened his own construction business after working with Tony, "that veterans don't need special programs or accommodations to succeed in civilian business. We just need to understand how our military skills apply to civilian markets." But the validation that meant the most to Tony came from the community he'd served for over a decade. The customers who trusted him with their cars had also trusted him with their safety when circumstances demanded it, and they continued to see him as their neighborhood mechanic who happened to have extraordinary backup capabilities. "Mr. Rodriguez," said Tommy Santos, now 13 years old and a regular visitor to the shop, "when I grow up, I want to serve my community the way you do. Not necessarily in the military, but finding ways to help people and keep them safe." Tony was teaching Tommy basic automotive maintenance, passing on practical skills while discussing the broader principles of service and responsibility that connected military and civilian life. "Tommy, service takes many forms. The important thing is finding work that helps others and contributes to your community's well-being. Whether that's in the military, law enforcement, healthcare, education, or running a business that serves your neighbors. Will you teach me about the explosive stuff too? Tony smiled, remembering his own curiosity about adult responsibilities when he was Tommy's age. Let's start with learning how engines work. The same problem-solving skills apply to both, but car engines are much safer to practice on. As Tony closed his shop at the end of another day, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from EOD specialist to community guardian. The path hadn't been linear or easy, but it had been exactly what his sense of purpose required and what his community needed. The tools in his shop represented different aspects of the same mission, solving problems that threatened people's safety and well-being, serving others regardless of recognition or reward, and maintaining readiness for whatever challenges might arise. Tony Rodriguez had learned that military service doesn't end with retirement, it evolves into civilian service that protects communities in ways that aren't always dramatic but are always essential. That the skills developed in war can be repurposed for peace. That sometimes the most important protection comes from people who are prepared for emergencies but spend most of their time preventing them. So I ask you, have you ever discovered that someone serving you in a civilian capacity had skills and experiences that went far beyond their job description? Someone whose military or emergency services background made them exactly the right person to handle a crisis you never expected to face. Share their story in the comments below, because here at the Human Stories, we believe that communities are protected by ordinary people with extraordinary backgrounds who continue serving long after they change uniforms. Tony's story reminds us that expertise developed in military service has civilian applications that benefit entire communities. That veterans don't need to choose between honoring their military experience and building civilian lives. That sometimes the person fixing your car might be exactly the person you need when everything goes wrong. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that service continues in many forms, that military skills have civilian value, and that the most important protectors are often the ones working quietly in our neighborhoods every day. We'll see you in the next story. And until then, remember, you never know when ordinary work might be performed by someone with extraordinary capabilities, ready to serve when service is needed most. Because that's what veterans do. They adapt, they serve, and they never stop protecting the people around them. The end.